Russia's recent invasion of Ukraine represents a change of the world order on par with, or perhaps greater than, 9/11, coronavirus, or perhaps even the fall of the Soviet Union. Some are calling it the early days of World War III, some the new Cold War, and others hope Russia will be rebuffed or mired down in Ukraine and that it won't spread beyond their borders. It is very slightly comforting to note that many of the world's most powerful and competent leaders, Macron, Trudeau, Erdogan, and indeed Putin himself, seem to be doing their best to prevent greater escalation. In truth, only time will tell how it pans out. As with all humans who have ever lived, we live on the bleeding edge of history. Most of you watching are high school students. In the best of times, high school isn't an easy phase of life. In these times, it's even worse. Catastrophes are unfolding quick enough that it's pretty hard to get your bearings straight. The future is increasingly uncertain, and hope sometimes seems increasingly hard to find. But while our challenges are certainly unique, they're not special. Again, humanity has lived through many unprecedented challenges. My simple advice, although it's hardly easy to follow, for those of you who are struggling: first, delete social media. Delete it and don't look back. Second, learn to meditate and exercise, even just a bit. 5 minutes of meditation and 5 minutes of exercise a day is far, far more than 0 minutes a day. Last, and perhaps most importantly, lean on your friends. And if you don't have friends, don't be afraid to try out religion. People have used religion for quite a long time for comfort. There are many churches in America, and some of them are even good. You can use Google Maps to see what other people have to say. Now, for those of you who are anxious, and for everyone else, let's ratchet your anxiety up to 11 out of 10 by taking a look at the second flashpoint that the debate world has focused on for years, East Asia, and to Japan, the world's third largest economy. In light of a dominant China, an assertive North Korea, and a potential conflict over Taiwan, should Japan revise its constitution to allow for offensive capabilities? Welcome to Debate Lectures with an Angel. Today, we discuss the following resolution. Japan should revise Article 9 of its constitution to develop offensive military capabilities. Let's first discuss a few terms related to the resolution. Up first, the Japanese Constitution. Following Japan's unconditional surrender at the end of World War II, the U.S. occupied Japan for 7 years, involving some 1 million Allied soldiers. The U.S. instituted many legal, economic, and social changes to Japan, like purging wartime officials, establishing unions, and feeding the starving populace. The Allied occupiers also wrote a new constitution for Japan, aligning it with the West and the newly created United Nation. This constitution remains in place today. Next, Article 9 itself. Japan's fighting in the Second World War was, to put it very mildly, savage. China, for example, suffered the second most deaths during World War II after the USSR. This was in part due to Japanese slaughter and often grotesque torture of innocent people. Through a combination of their own history, culture, and geopolitics, Japanese society had become a war-fighting machine that vowed to fight to the last person alive in Japan, similar to North Korea today. Dan Carlin details this development in his fascinating 27-hour-long podcast, Supernova in the East. As a result, The Allies had a firm motivation to prevent the Japanese war machine from rising again. Thus, Article 9 of the Constitution was born, a constitutional promise to never build a military or participate in war. Here is the official English text. Article 9. 1. Inspiring sincerely to an international peace based on justice and order, the Japanese people forever renounce war as a sovereign right of the nation, and the threat or use of force as means of settling international disputes. 2. In order to accomplish the aim of the preceding paragraph, land, sea, and air forces, as well as other war potential, will never be maintained. The right of belligerency of the state will not be recognized. Next, the Self-Defense Forces, Japanese military. The Japanese Self-Defense Forces, or JSDF, arose over the years in a slow creep. First, Japan instituted a national police reserve. Then, they added a coastal safety force, a kind of coast guard. Then an airborne wing. Former Prime Minister Nakasone pledged to make Japan a, quote, unsinkable aircraft carrier in the Pacific, end quote. And former Prime Minister Abe has even tried to revise Article 9. The name Self-Defense Forces is a certain kind of doublespeak, similar to the military doublespeak used around the world. In the US, of course, we don't have a war office, as we had until 1949. Instead, we have a Ministry of Defense. This doublespeak is a kind of legal necessity in Japan, owing to the constitutional prohibition on building a military. The modern Japanese military may not be a military by Japanese law, but it certainly is according to international law. In fact, one of the strongest in the world. From the Associated Press. Japan has more than 900 warplanes, 48 destroyers, including 8 Aegis missile combat systems, and 20 submarines. That exceeds Britain, Germany, and Italy. Japan is also buying 147 F-35s, including 42 F-35Bs, making it the largest user of American stealth fighters outside of the United States. Next, let's discuss the term offensive. The line between offense and defense in military can be blurry. As they say, the best defense is a good offense. Still, the general bent of Japanese equipment is defensive, like anti-tank, anti-ship, and anti-missile systems. They also have a large amount of tanks and artillery. But again, this might be crucial in repelling an invasion. While much of this equipment is domestically produced by Japanese manufacturing giants like Fuji, Mitsubishi, Honda, and Toyota, many advanced systems are purchased from abroad, with 90% of defense imports coming from the US. Now, when we talk about developing Japan's offensive capabilities, we're really talking about weapon systems that bring the fight to the enemy. Specifically, medium and long-range missile systems, and cyber attacks that could hit enemy military installations in event of a war, thus slowing the enemy's ability to damage Japan. Next, let's break down Japan's relationship with neighboring and allied countries to give you an understanding of how its military forces might come into play. Throughout this section, I'll describe how Imperial Japan committed atrocities against these neighbors and sowed historical bad blood that remains to this day. These descriptions aren't meant to be shocking. In fact, they're quite sanitized in this video. They're also not meant to degrade Japan, one of the most impressive and singular cultures on this planet. The history of colonization almost always reads like this, no matter which country is doing it. But without this background, it may be difficult to understand why there is so much hatred for Japan. First, we'll begin with its largest neighbor, China. Japan maybe obviously has a long history with its powerful neighbor, a history of exchange with Japan borrowing from China's writing system, culture, and philosophy. The relationship has alternately been one of friendship and animosity. Japan invaded China in 1931, occupying much of the country. It fought several wars with China and didn't fully leave until 1945. In China, World War II is simply known as the Japanese War. Amongst their crimes were mass slaughters, such as the famed Nanking Massacre, and atrocities that will haunt you if you fully absorb their impact. Look up Unit 731 in Harbin if you want the horrific details. Harbin was the first city I lived in Asia, and I can personally attest that the hatred for Japanese runs deep. These are things that aren't easy to forget, and China will likely harbor bad blood against the Japanese for generations to come. As Japan remained closely attached to the US throughout the Cold War and Korean Wars, tensions between China and Japan have remained high. Next, the Koreas. Imperial Japan's history with Korea is no less brutal. Recall that South and North Korea have, until recently, always been known as, well, Korea. Korea was slowly imperialized by Japan over a number of decades and formally annexed in 1910. Like with China, this occupation didn't end until 1945, when the Japanese surrendered. And like with many of their colonies, Japan improved the infrastructure and economy of the Korean peninsula. And like many of their other colonies, like almost every historical colony in fact, the Japanese brutalized the Korean people, intentionally destroying their culture and religion and forcing them to take Japanese names. They forced hundreds of thousands of men into slavery, and hundreds of thousands of Korean comfort women, a euphemism for sex slaves, were forced to work in Japanese military brothels. Japan has never apologized for these crimes, and Korea has never forgiven them. North Korea retains a rather pure version of this hatred towards Japan. South Korea's hatred is complicated by the fact that strategically, if not formally, they're military allies, part of the U.S. alliance. Japan would be a staging ground for the U.S.-led defense of South Korea in the event of an invasion, and the two countries have shared intelligence about North Korea. However, the bad blood of Japanese atrocities does interfere with their ability to communicate well, and the prospect of Japan's military growing stronger with a revised Article 9 may be more frightening to South Korea, than it is comforting. Next, let's touch on Taiwan. Taiwan's occupation by Japan from 1895 until, you guessed it, 1945, was on the whole much more positive than South Korea's. Japan improved the infrastructure, industries, and education systems on the island. That's not to say it was all positive. Oppression by and revolts against the Japanese government were common. But in the intervening years, the Taiwanese have developed a strong relationship with Japan, which has greatly influenced Taiwanese culture, language, and thankfully, their cuisine. Next, the Philippines. My first time in the Philippines, I was shocked to find out that not only is Filipino not a language, but that English is very widespread. The Philippines was never colonized by Japan, but not because they didn't want to. In fact, according to Wikipedia, Japan offered to buy the islands from Spain for $3 million in gold, an offer that Spain refused. America took control of the country after the Spanish-American War, explaining both their high English proficiency and the failure of the American education system that had failed to teach me that Philippines was an American colony. However, during the Second World War, the country became an important strategic asset and was fought over between the Japanese and Allied forces. 1 million Filipinos died during the conflict, and as in Korea, many comfort women were taken as sex slaves by the Japanese military. Despite this, Japanese-Filipino relations are good, and, again from Wikipedia, fully 84% of Filipinos view Japan favorably. Finally, on to Russia. Japanese-Russian relationships have historically been cordial, until Japan's occupation of China, and especially the Manchurian puppet state, brought the Japanese Empire into border conflicts with Russia, eventually leading to the Russo-Japanese War. After the Japanese surrender in World War II, Russia seized the Kuril island chain to the north of Japan, and the dispute over ownership of these islands remains till this day. However, on the whole, Japan has recently seen Russia as a strategic regional partner to counterbalance the North Korean threat. After all, Russia holds a lot of sway in North Korea. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has soured, or perhaps even severed relations between the two countries, with Japan following its allies in laying heavy sanctions on Japan. Now, there are other regional allies we haven't mentioned: Vietnam, Malaysia, Singapore, and others that could all come into play in case of a war. But these are the big neighborhood players. Next, let's discuss the last major ally of Japan, the United States. The U.S. is Japan's major military partner. 55,000 military personnel are spread across 120 bases and facilities in the country, a large extension of the U.S.'s military empire. The two countries frequently participate in joint military exercises, and Japan falls under the U.S.'s nuclear umbrella, which is to say, if Japan is ever attacked with a nuclear weapon, again, the U.S. has vowed to retaliate on Japan's behalf, thus obviating Japan's need for developing its own nuclear weapons. The Japanese have different views on the American bases, with some appreciating the extended support, but some seeing it as an occupation of their country. This especially holds true for the beautiful and culture-rich but small island of Okinawa, where American bases occupy a large percentage of the island's area. Very finally, let's touch on the Quad. The Quadrilateral Security Dialogue was formed with the purpose of opposing Chinese military power. The partnership is composed of Japan, the US, India, and Australia, although a Quad Plus meeting to combat COVID-19 also included New Zealand, South Korea, and Vietnam. In addition, France, Germany, the UK, and other Western nations have contributed to the goals of the Quad, particularly by sailing freedom of navigation exercises through the Taiwan Straits and through the South China Sea. Now, let's move on to our arguments. Should Japan revise Article 9 to develop offensive military capabilities? For pro, Japan's pacifist attitude has served it well in the years since the Second World War, but the world we live in now is different. With a dangerous and nuclear-armed North Korea, an assertive China, and a newly aggressive Russia, Japan's security situation calls for a constitutional change. Perhaps right at the top of the list of threats to Japan is the China threat. Japan's powerful neighbor is growing, and its claims to territory around it are growing with it. Remember that any large country, modern China included, only get to be large by taking territory. If they didn't, they wouldn't be so large. The main territorial dispute between China and Japan, and Taiwan as well, are the Senkaku Islands, known in China as the Diaoyu Islands. Both countries push heavy propaganda about the claims and regularly patrol the waters around these undeveloped and uninhabited islands. From Grady 21. The China Coast Guard's aggressive behavior around the Senkaku Islands, Beijing's buildup of coastal military capabilities, and this weekend's transit of a People's Liberation Army Navy carrier strike group around Okinawa underline Tokyo's need for its own offensive military capability resources, a leading Japanese security expert said. He called for the Japanese Air Self-Defense Force to have a long-range precision strike that could target Chinese coastal bases and ports as a deterrent to future aggression. Now, as always, pause the video to see if you can come up with your own rebuttals for the China threat argument. Here are mine. One of the main issues with preparing the military against China is that China is a huge and powerful neighbor. So while it's easier for Americans an ocean away to talk about confronting China, the stakes are in every way much higher for Japan. Furthermore, aside from the aforementioned uninhabited islands, it doesn't seem that China has any designs on Japanese territory. economic coercion seems to be their preferred tool. And given that China is Japan's #1 trading partner, it's yet another reason not to provoke China. Lastly, fielding offensive weapons might give China an incentive to strike preemptively to ensure a victory in any confrontation with Japan. The second threat that Japan needs some deterrence from is North Korea. North Korea's missile tests are most regularly aimed at or near Japan. North Korea, of course, has nuclear weapons as well. As we've seen from the ongoing Ukraine invasion, nuclear weapons are a threat no one takes lightly. Offensive weapons could allow Tokyo to disable North Korea's launch capabilities in the event of a nuclear strike, or even a conventional attack was being prepared. From Johnson 21, North Korea has highlighted its growing military muscle with the launch of a, quote, new type of submarine-launched ballistic missile, a move that has intensified talk in Tokyo of Japan acquiring the capability to strike enemy bases. Now, how to answer the North Korea threat argument. The best argument against an extreme Japanese response to North Korea, like changing the constitution, may indeed be that such a change could ratchet up tensions and possibly even invite a first strike. More importantly, any offensive capabilities would be useless against a North Korean nuclear attack. Next argument for pro, let's take a look at one of the most likely offensive weapons for Japan to gain, which is missiles. Both medium and long-range missiles that are capable of striking China and North Korea. These missiles would serve two purposes. First strike capabilities mean that if Japan suspected an imminent attack, it could launch a preemptive attack to disable enemy missile capabilities or other military assets to prevent them from being used against Japan itself. Second, these missiles provide deterrence. If China knew, for example, that Japan was capable of hitting major coastal cities with a large barrage of missiles, they might think twice before launching an attack against Japan. Pause the video to think of any rebuttals to Japan acquiring missiles. Fielding anything but defensive missiles would likely spur a huge backlash from the Japanese public, who since World War II have adopted a firm pacifist stance. From Walton 20, quote, "The major obstacle to amendment is the extraordinary emotional responses Article 9 generates from the public. For many Japanese, Article 9 is an unambiguous statement that Japan will never again be an aggressor nation," end quote. In addition, it's not clear that these missiles would stop China from accomplishing its military goals. Taiwan has intermediate-range missiles like the hypersonic Yunfeng missile capable of striking Chinese coastal cities, but China has still not ruled out the use of force to conquer the island. Let's look at some of the other weapons that may be put into play if Japan were to revise its constitution. First, nuclear weapons. The ongoing threat of a nuclear-armed North Korea and the expanding presence and capabilities of the world's second most powerful military, China, may necessitate an invasion-proof Japan. The US already has nuke-sharing agreements with other countries like Turkey, as we've recently touched on, along with Belgium, Germany, Italy, and the Netherlands. Former Prime Minister Abe recently suggested that Japan follow suit. Bandao 20, quoting Abe, "We need to understand how security is maintained around the world and not consider it taboo to have an open discussion." End quote. Here he's talking about nuclear weapons. Pause the video to think of rebuttals. Of course, most of Japan does hold this taboo. As the only country to have suffered a nuclear attack, Japan isn't likely to throw off its nuclear taboo anytime soon. In addition, these weapons just aren't needed. Japan is safely under America's nuclear umbrella, and an attack on Japan could be countered with America's substantial arsenal. In addition, Japan is already boosting its military R&D to keep up with China, and pro can argue should continue to do so. Indeed, much of this research and development is in weapons that certainly seem offensive. This is Harper 21. For fiscal year 2022, the Japanese Defense Ministry is requesting approximately $2.8 billion for research and development, a 50% increase from the previous year. Much of that will be used to invest in game-changing technologies such as space, cyber, electronic warfare, artificial intelligence, and directed energy weapons, end quote. Tell me if that doesn't sound offensive to you. Given the recognition of Japan's need for offensive weapons, perhaps it's finally time for Japan to change its constitution to align with reality. Now answers. This particular card, Harper 21, can seem non-unique. If Japan is already increasing its spending, why should it modify its constitution? Here, the status quo seems to work just fine for Japan's defense. In addition, there is one technicality. Japan's Article 9 prohibits an army, a navy, or an air force. But 70 years ago, they failed to prohibit high-tech space and AI weapons. Despite the spirit of the law, these systems technically aren't banned by Article 9. The next argument for pro is self-reliance. Donald Trump famously criticized Japan for its minimal military spending, claiming that the U.S. was pulling too much of the weight for Japanese defense. Although Biden doesn't share this opinion, there may be something to it. From Bandow 20. Quote, despite possessing a GDP in excess of $5 trillion, Tokyo continues to be stingy when it comes to its military. Last year, defense outlays were but 0.95% of GDP. This is well below South Korea and Australia, and even less than the pitiful Philippines, end quote. The betting odds are that Trump will be our next president. So although we have a couple more years of the status quo, it's likely that Trump round 2 will want Japan to start paying more for its defense. How can we answer this? Maybe defense spending is low, but would more spending create more defense? Indeed, beefing up military spending could create backlash from neighboring countries and put Japan at risk. In addition, if military spending were to increase, why would it need to be on offensive capabilities? This is also not clear. Last, while America does contribute a lot to Japanese defense, it's a two-way deal. America gets to use Japanese bases as forward operating centers to project its imperial power to East Asia. Our final argument for pro in this video is about Taiwan. Japan seems increasingly willing to defend Taiwan from a Chinese attack as part of a Chinese containment strategy, containing China to the first island chain as it's known, surrounding China's coastline and comprising the island nations of Japan, Taiwan, and the Philippines. Ashley 21. Quote, Japan's most recent defense white paper discussed Taiwan as, quote, important for Japan's security and the stability of the international community. In addition, Japanese politicians are making several once unthinkable statements supporting Taiwan, like Defense Minister Nobuo Kishi's assertion that the peace and stability of Taiwan are directly connected to Japan, end quote. How can we answer this? The Taiwanese people should no doubt be able to determine their own futures. This is true. But Japan getting involved in such a conflict could result in devastating losses to the Japanese homeland. From Bandow 21. Staying out of a China-Taiwan confrontation might be dangerous for Tokyo, but not as dangerous as joining. Supporting America against China would increase the former's likelihood of victory, but even success would be dearly bought. Although the U.S. has Pacific possessions with an easy reach of Chinese weapons, the American homeland is well distant. In contrast, Japan is close and would be an inevitable military target. Moreover, any conflict likely would not end in a Chinese defeat. Rather, Beijing would begin rearming for the next round. A defeat so close to the mainland by foreign powers would put the PRC in greater danger than before. Like Germany after losing World War I, Beijing would be counted on to seek vindication and revenge, early and often. That is it for pro. If you have or can think of any other pro arguments, feel free to leave it in the comments below. If not, let's move on to con. For con, Article 9 has served to further economic growth in Japan, to prevent involvement in conflict, to keep peace in East Asia, and hasn't prevented Japan from building a formidable military. Changing Article 9 might serve to put Japan in more danger, not make it safer. Let's first look at defense. Nobody is arguing that Japan doesn't need more defense. Indeed, these efforts are already underway. From Smith 21, in 2013, Japan announced a new national security strategy, and in 2018, it adopted a 10-year defense plan and a midterm procurement plan to realize it. After years of stagnation in military spending, the SDF was overdue for upgrades in air and maritime defense systems. New advancement by Japan's neighbors have also spurred calls for investment in space and cyber capabilities. End quote. And indeed, perhaps Japan should continue down this road of defense. But the disadvantages of increasing offensive capabilities, as we'll see soon, certainly outweigh its harms. Now, rebuttals. Unfortunately, Pro can argue, defensive systems are not adequate. Offensive capabilities would allow Japan to disable part of the enemy's capabilities before an attack, thus reducing Japan's damage in the event of war. Yamaguchi 21. Quote, almost all wars today are fought as an exercise of the right of self-defense, and they usually involve launching an attack on an enemy state before it can attack you. End quote. Additionally, offensive systems provide a deterrence effect that purely defensive systems don't. Quote, Japan should work towards developing long-range strike capabilities to better protect its territory and people, augment alliance deterrence and defense capabilities. It's Klinger 21. Next, let's look at, for Khan, the risk of escalation. The biggest risk of Japan's constitutional change is escalating tensions with its neighbors, in an environment where tensions are already quite high. ISDP 18, quote, it would almost certainly ignite protest amongst the country's neighbors due to the historical association of Japanese imperialism and wartime aggression. An amendment to Article 9, if not done with sufficient tact, could increase regional tensions and cause more harm than good to Japan's security situation. End quote. In addition, Japan seems to eschew guardrails to adequately manage interactions with its neighbors, again, likely because of the bad blood left behind from Japanese imperialism. This is Rodriguez 14. Quote, currently, Japanese officials indicate publicly and privately, A, the lack of a strategic buffer zone between Chinese and Japanese coastal guard fleets, B, sole reliance on the U.S. to defuse potential conflict escalation scenarios, and C, little direct dialogue between belligerents, not only with China, but also South Korea, dramatically heightens the risk of regional war. End quote. Now, how to answer escalation. Given Japan's history, a constitutional change might very well rile its neighbors, but an increasingly aggressive China and a nuclear-armed North Korea might rile their own neighbors as well. Regardless of the feelings of their nuclear-armed neighbors, Japan has a right to a modern military and to adequate defense. Next, first strike incentive. For Khan, why Japan should not modify its constitution. First strike incentive. Escalating tensions could lead to war for Japan. In a military conflict, opponents would be tempted to strike Japanese offensive capabilities before they had time to engage, as we discussed earlier for why Japan needs missiles. Hornung 20, quote, if a crisis erupts, knowing Japan possesses strike capability, North Korea or China may actually have incentives to preemptively attack Japan to ensure early success. Now, how to answer this? Given the power of China's military, and given the recklessness of North Korea, who regularly launch ballistic missiles over and around Japan, the time to worry about first strikes has long passed. Japan would certainly be a target in any regional military conflict. So Japan needs to amend its constitution to allow it to develop offensive capabilities that its neighbors have. Third argument for Khan is pacifism. Japan's Article 9 represents not just legal pacifism, but a deep cultural norm. If countries like China and Korea are appalled by Japanese imperialist history, Japan itself may have some historical PTSD over its own history. In fact, the Article 9 was a key component in defense of the Yoshida Doctrine, a policy of former Japanese Prime Minister Yoshida Shigeru that de-emphasized the military while emphasizing economic growth. Norwegian historian and research professor Stein Tonensen argues that this doctrine, adopted by countries like China, Singapore, Malaysia, Vietnam, and Taiwan, has led to the lack of violence and strong economic growth of post-war Asia. This is Tonensen 14. Quote, Article 9 has set real limits to the size of the Japanese military. This has served both Japan and the region well. Article 9 is an integral part of the East Asian peace. The region would look different and more dangerous if it were revised or abolished. Japan's neighbors would see this as a sign that Japan may start acting on its own, outside the confines of its U.S. alliance. This would not lead quickly to war, but could gradually destabilize the region. End quote. How should we answer pacifism? East Asia has been relatively peaceful, but it's not clear this is a direct result of Article 9. The economic growth of the Yoshida Doctrine would have been very likely without Article 9. Furthermore, East Asia is already being destabilized by Japan's neighbors China, North Korea, and Russia. The Japanese constitution and armed forces should ensure the safety of Japan, and for that, Article 9 needs a revision. Another note on pacifism. Perhaps most importantly, the Japanese public doesn't want the constitution amended. Japan's pacifist stance is as important in Japan as guns are to Americans. Imagine the blowback of America trying to overturn the Second Amendment. Walton 20, quote, the major obstacle to amendment is the extraordinary emotional responses Article 9 generates from the public. For many Japanese, Article 9 is an unambiguous statement that Japan will never again be an aggressor nation, end quote. Answering public support. Japanese society is indeed quite pacifist. This doesn't mean that they should be. The public should likely not be trusted with matters of national defense, and an adequate defense of Japan may necessitate building out and even using offensive military capabilities. Regardless of public opinion, a constitutional change could help Japan to prepare for future warfighting needs. The last argument I'll present to you for Khan is flexibility. Another argument against changing this law is that, in the status quo, Japanese politicians already have enough flexibility to wage war if they need to, under the right conditions. Quote, regardless of the original intent, the language describing a survival-threatening situation is flexible enough to apply directly to Taiwan if the Japanese cabinet determines such a course to be necessary. In such a scenario, an attack on Taiwan could constitute, in effect, the initiation of an attack on Japan, closely connecting an armed attack against Taiwan with a direct threat to Japan's survival, end quote. That's Gaelic 21. If changing the Constitution has other disadvantages, therefore, the flexibility of interpreting the law as it wishes should leave Japan with enough options to deal with the contingencies of the future, once again, without changing the Constitution. How to answer this? Laws are always flexible to interpretation, but that doesn't make them meaningless. Japan needs transparency and openness about its military in order to make it safer and more effective. And to do that, it needs a constitutional change that brings its military in line with reality. Without further revisions, the gap between reality and Japan's current security regime will only widen, and Japan is setting itself up for a domestic or international alliance crisis, and possibly both. End quote. That's Krauss 18. That's it for this topic. As always, you can find briefs with the evidence that was cited and shown here, and much more evidence, and even more arguments, put together by myself and the one and only Krish Mawalkar on our website at debatetrack.com. And if you'd like, leave a comment below, leave us a like, and give us a follow if you haven't already. Have a beautiful topic, and I will see you next month for Nationals. Peace and love. Bye-bye.